We saw that a word pair which proves that two different phones are different phonemes is called a minimal pair. So this means we have two words that are the same in every way except that one sound is switched for another. And if it turns out that those two words, even though they're only different by one sound, if it turns out that they have a different meaning, that's proof that those two sounds belong to separate phonemes. So let's look at some examples of this. Pit versus bit. Pit with that puff of air versus bit. So these two words are the same in every way except for the first consonant. But the meaning is different. Pit, I threw you in a pit. My dog bit me. So this shows that these two sounds must belong to separate phonemes. This first one belongs to the phoneme we often write with the letter that looks like P. The second one belongs to the phoneme we often write with the letter that looks like B. But this is a minimal pair. Two different meanings, they're only different by one sound. This is a sign that they're contrastive. These two sounds contrast. They contrast in meaning. Wreath versus wreath. These are two different words in English too. They have two different meanings. They're only different in the nature of this last fricative. Wreath is the verb to weave something into a wreath, and then wreath would be the product of that weaving. So this is proof that the and th are contrastive, that these belong to different phonemes. These are also non-predictable sounds. Sounds would be predictable if I always knew that this variant, this allophone occurs in this situation, and the other one occurs in a different situation. They would never occur in the same place. But here we don't have any such pattern. P is occurring at the beginning of a word before an E. B is occurring at the beginning of a word before an E. There's no way to predict which version do I get this sound or this sound if I only know the environment that it's in. Here again, the and th, they both occur at the end of the word after an E. There's no way I can predict just by the environment. Oh, it's a word that starts with re and then there's a blank. I know exactly which one it's going to be. No, it could be either a the or a th. There's no way to predict it. This is an interesting case of a minimal pair where it would really depend on the dialect or the accent that I'm going for. So for most American English speakers, which and which, there's no difference in meaning between them. If I see all of these and I'm asking the question, which is green, the dialect I grew up speaking, I would use this one both times, which is green. But there are people who would say, which is green, which is green, where this is a voiceless labiovelar approximant. But for me, I really have a hard time hearing the difference. If I were to reverse it and say which is green, it still means the same thing. It's asking the same question. I don't use this difference between these two sounds to make any difference in meaning. So these two sounds are non-contrastive. Non-contrastive, it's not a minimal pair. So it's interesting, by looking at these minimal pairs, once I know minimal pair, I know something about what babies who grew up speaking this language had to pay attention to or had to keep in their mind. So if I see these as minimal pairs, I know they're minimal pairs, so I can write them in the phonemic transcription with the brackets because I know we're talking about the actual sound categories here. I have a sound, this would be sh, something like sh, this would be shan. So if sh means something different than shan, that means that these are in separate phonemes. If I'm a baby in this language, it becomes very important to me to pay attention to, is the vowel nasal or non-nasal? I'm going to be a very sensitive baby. I'm going to keep this ability into my adulthood of listening to the difference in nasality in a vowel or not. So this is like the French chat, which means cat, or chant, which means song. The only difference is the vowel. If I can hear the difference between t and tu, and t and tu is a meaning difference, that these two mean totally different things, I'm a baby who had to grow up paying attention to whether a vowel is rounded or not. Yes, E and U are both high, both front vowels. The only difference is this is unrounded and this is rounded. So maybe you can pause the video and see if you can guess what are the other features, the phonetic features, that a baby would have to grow up paying attention to in these languages in order for these to be actual minimal pairs. In this case, the baby would have to grow up learning that this is d, this is t. If these are a minimal pair, they're two different meanings. then they would have to pay attention to the difference to whether a consonant is voiced or voiceless. If these are two different words, pal and pal, a baby would have to grow up paying attention to whether this final consonant is palatalized or non-palatalized. And then here in this one, the baby would have to grow up paying attention to whether a vowel is tense or lax, or whether this consonant is aspirated or unaspirated. Those phonetic distinctions are used to make a minimal pair a meaningful phonemic contrast in this language. Here's some data from Latvian, which is another group of minimal pairs. Riga is the city Riga, the capital of Latvia. Riga means in Riga. Masa means mass, masa means sister. Gada means annual, gada is in the year. Par means about, par means above. So a Latvian baby would have to grow up. These are minimal pairs. There's a meaning difference between the short ah and the long ah. Short ah and long ah here. They're minimal pairs. They're the same in every other way except that one contrast. It's a meaningful contrast. So a Latvian baby would have to grow up paying very close attention to vowel length because it changes the meaning of a word. An English-speaking baby wouldn't. If we have these English words, cob and cob, cop and cop, par, Nissan, they're both, cob and cob mean the thing that corn comes on. Cop and cop both mean police. Par and par both mean how many golf strokes I should swing. Nissan and Nissan both mean a brand of car. It wouldn't change the meaning of the word. Vowel length is an allophonic difference in English, not a phonemic one, unlike Latvian where it's a phonemic contrast. It's important. It's used to make a distinction between words. Sometimes one allophone is always used in a particular environment or particular setting next to a certain group of sounds, and then a different allophone of that same phoneme is always used in the other environment. We call this complementary distribution. For example, aspirated and unreleased P in English. There's a clear pattern about this. We use the aspirated allophone of the P phoneme, the one that sounds like P, if this occurs at the beginning of a syllable. We use the unreleased version of this up, if this occurs at the end of a syllable. There's this clear pattern. It's a non-contrastive. I could switch out one for the other. It wouldn't change the meaning of the word, but it is predictable. I always know I'll find one variant here and the other variant there. I'll never find that one in this one's territory. I'll never find this one in that one's territory. So you can think of it again as like Clark Kent and Superman. This is sort of predictable distribution. So this, whatever we call that being who's from the planet Krypton, he always takes the form of Clark Kent when he's at the Daily Planet. He always takes the form of Superman when saving people. He never is going to take the other form. He's never Clark Kent while he's flying around saving people, and he's never Superman while working at the Daily Planet. There's a clear, predictable pattern of where this being is going to show up as Clark Kent or where this being will show up as Superman. In English, as I said, we'll always find the P phoneme being pronounced as this aspirated one, P, in words like pot, pig, or apple, where it's at the beginning of a syllable, or flower pot, and we're always going to pronounce it the unreleased version up in words like stop or gap, where there's no aspiration when it's at the end of a syllable. There's this clear, predictable pattern. The word pop actually uses one of each. The first one is the aspirated one. The last P is this unreleased one, pop, pop. If I said it bop, bop, the meaning wouldn't change. It still would mean the soft drink or the sound that an exploding thing makes. It would give me a very strange accent, though. It's not the English sound system. It's not the fingerprint of the American accent. But I'm just mixing up the rule. It's not a minimal pair. It doesn't change the meaning of the word. So these are both allophones of the same phoneme, but they're in complementary distribution. Clark Kent and Superman are in complementary distribution. Together they make up the total amount of appearances that this could make. The aspirated and unreleased versions of this, they're in complementary distribution. They have a clear distinction who is in what territory, and the other one stays out of the other one's territory. Another bit of data for this, like the English L, so we have that larger phoneme L that has lots of different variants. It's going to be the alveolar one, la, whenever it occurs at the beginning of a syllable before a vowel. It's going to be the alveolar one l if it's after a consonant before a vowel. It's going to be the velar one ol if it's at the end of a syllable, and it'll be l, the alveolar one, between vowels. So I have this pattern of where I would find which allophone of l, and together it makes up complementary distribution. I know that this phoneme L is always going to take the form of a l at the end of a syllable in English, and it will take the form of a l anywhere else. So that would be the allophonic rule. I've got a phoneme that has two allophones in it, and here's the clear rule, the clear pattern for where I would find one and where I would find the other. And we can write these rules in this way. The phoneme whatever gets pronounced as allophone 1 in environment 1. This same phoneme would get pronounced as allophone 2 in environment 2. So for example, the rule for voiceless stops, in this word tot, it's made of three phonemes, a T category, an A category, and a T category. It would actually get pronounced as tot because in this position, the rule is that the phoneme T gets pronounced as the aspirated one t at the beginning of a syllable before a vowel. It gets pronounced as the unreleased one at the end of a syllable. In the word stop, it gets pronounced as aspirated but released after an S before a vowel, and it gets pronounced as the unaspirated one at the end of a syllable. So I could write a clear rule about which environments I would find which allophone in. The rule for flapping T and D, the T phoneme and the D phoneme both end up getting pronounced as this ara, ara, ara sound between vocalic things, between vowels. So bitter, which would be made of 5 sounds, some B-like sounds, some I-like sounds, some T-like sounds, some vowel unstressed, and some R. It gets actually pronounced by most Americans as bitter because T between two vowels gets pronounced as a D. Here, T between two vowels gets pronounced as a R. This little line, remember, means that the M is acting as a vowel. Bottom, where is a vowel, or battle, where this L becomes its own vowel. So that's why it gets this variant. R isn't considered a phoneme of English. It's just the allophone of T or the allophone of D that gets pronounced between vowels. Or nasal and non-nasal vowels in English, the word Sam is pronounced by some S-like sound, some A-like sound, some M-like sound, and the particular A-like sound that gets pronounced here is a nasal one because it's before the nasal consonant M, so it's Sam. But before sat, where it's a non-nasal consonant, it's a regular oral A, sat, sat, Sam, Sam, sat. So the allophone, I use a nasal allophone and a non-nasal allophone. In the word send, again, because N is a nasal consonant, I would pronounce the nasal variant of the phoneme E. Send, not send, send. I can't even do the oral one as an English speaker very well. So the allophonic rule for the phoneme P, which allophone of the phoneme P should I use where? They'll take the form of a rule that says P is always pronounced as P at the beginning of a syllable and as at the end. So it would look like this. The phoneme P gets pronounced as P, and remember, this could be called a shark or a car or a squid, whatever. I'm just using this for convenience sake. It gets pronounced as P if it occurs after the beginning of a syllable. So this would be the beginning of the word, the syllable boundary. If it occurs right after the syllable boundary, aka the beginning of a syllable, it will be pronounced as P. This phoneme P gets pronounced as up if it occurs right before a syllable boundary. So if it's happening right before the end of a word, right before the syllable boundary, that would mean it's at the end of the syllable. And in the end of a syllable, the phoneme P always gets pronounced as the allophone up, up. So the phoneme P is pronounced as P in the environment of the beginning of a syllable. That's how we would read a rule like this. The other allophonic rule here, A means a nasalized version of the phoneme A. So the phoneme A would get pronounced as A before a M, before a N, or before a Ng. This phoneme A gets pronounced as A everywhere else, anywhere else. This is an assimilation rule. So this phoneme A, which is normally not nasal, gets pronounced as the nasal version, its nasal allophone, because it's becoming more like the sound that follows it. And it turns out this is a lot what happens in pronunciation. A sound changes, it takes on a different allophone in order to become more similar to the sound that comes right after it or the sound that came before it. This means it's easier to pronounce. We have to do less work. In this data set, we have a single phoneme, N, in these words. Remember, a phoneme would be the underlying abstract sound. So if you were to ask an English speaker, what sound is that word made of? They would almost always say, it's a N. It's an N sound. It's a N sound. Even when it's technically not. So like a word like infer actually gets pronounced as infer. This M with a tail is a labiodental nasal. Ma, ma, ma. Infer, infer. I can't infer what you want to say. Infer. I'm pronouncing this labiodentally. So this alveolar phoneme takes on a labiodental shape. Why? To assimilate with its following sound, which is also a labiodental F. It's much easier to already put your tongue in that labiodental position when you pronounce the nasal consonant, rather than having to switch from an alveolar to a labiodental. Same thing here, anvil is actually pronounced, when we say it fast, anvil, anvil, anvil. It's this labiodental sound. Enthused would be pronounced as dentalized, enthused, in order to match the dentalness of the following interdental sound, enthused. So English speakers wouldn't think about that. They would have never realized that this N is dental and it makes a different sound than a regular N. But it does, because it's trying to become more like its neighbor, more like the sound following it. Same thing with in this story, this is a dental nasal, because it's matching the following sound. Can pick, I can pick them, I can pick the right team. It actually becomes can pick. The N becomes bilabial in order to match the following bilabial stop. Unbend would become unbend, unbend, unbend. It has, again, this M sound to match the following bilabial. Unglue becomes unglue. So it stays, we would think about it's made of ung-ga-le, because nga and na, this is a phonemic contrast. So we have a separate phoneme ung for the ung-like sounds and a separate phoneme na for the na-like sounds. We could make a minimal pair which proves that na and nga are separate phonemes, like sin and sing, or tan and tang, where the following nasal sound is actually going to change the meaning of the word. It's minimal pair. So concur, ensue, this is a normal alveolar N. Unto, unloose, because sa, ta, and la are alveolar sounds and stays in its expected position as an alveolar. And then ya is a palatal sound and the N becomes palatalized. Onion, unused, anya, nya, onion, unused. So this underlying alveolar sound gets pronounced as the palatal version because it's trying to match its following palatal consonant. So there's lots of kinds of these allophonic rules. The way that a sound would get changed, or rules that would explain what allophone of a phoneme I would actually pronounce. In an underlying word like Clemson, so this is a university in South Carolina, a lot of times to make it easier to pronounce, people actually insert a sound, Clemson. We should call this an insertion rule. It takes the underlying sound categories and actually sticks in an extra sound that would split up the ma and the sa. So this is a special fingerprint of some American accents, that you would pronounce this word as Clemson instead of as Clemson. Sense, you don't have any sense. We often do put a t sound in there. It's very hard for us to pronounce a na right immediately followed by a sa. Usually a kind of a ghost T would be inserted, sense. Length, you'd get a K, length. Tree, you'd get a sh, tree. Drive, you would get a j, drive. Drink. There's deletion rules. Sixths is too hard to say, so we'll say it as sixth. Fifth is too hard to say, so we'll say it as fifth. Got her would become got her. And then even you can have a switching rule where nuclear could get pronounced as nuclear. So these are all different types of allophonic rule. There's even strengthening rules and weakening rules. Harry Potter becomes Harry Potter, or Harry Potter becomes Harry Potter, right? So the H gets strengthened to a glottal stop from a fricative, Harry, and this T gets weakened to a glottal stop from a T to become Potter, Harry Potter, in like kind of a Cockney accent.